Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Luc Tissot. I'm Technical Director for IC Design at Mentor, a Siemens business, or Siemens CDA as we call ourselves now. It is my pleasure to welcome Malcolm Penn, Chairman and CEO of Future Horizons, a leading semiconductor industry analyst. Malcolm founded Future Horizons in 1989. He has 55 years of experience in the global semiconductor industry and the electronics industry, including new business development, product management, manufacturing, marketing, and design. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Malcolm for his presentation. Malcolm.
Thank you, Luke, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to this keynote session of U2U 2020. I'd like to spend the next 20 minutes or so sharing with you my views on the outlook for the chip industry in 2021, and at the same time share with you some of the ground rules and matrices that historically have shown very useful in gauging the temperature and outlook for the industry. When it comes to making sense of the industry tea leaves, forecasting is never an exact science, nor does it lend itself to precise modeling prognoses. But there are several factors that clearly influence and drive the industry and give a good indication of how the future will play. These are the technology push, Moore's law and the physics of science, the market pull, doing what was previously impossible before, production, the relationship between supply and demand, and the economy, which greases the wheels not just for the semiconductor industry, but for the whole world economy. And what we do is we try to look at as much analysis of the hard data that we can to understand each of those factors. So for the economy, we look at the IMF data. For semiconductor sales, the World Semiconductor Trade Statistics Organization. SEMI gives good CapEx and wafer production data, plus company reports and in-house proprietary database that we've built up over the 50-plus years that we've been doing and working in the industry. In that way, we try to build as much of the jigsaw puzzle as possible, but then we use our own experience to try to analyze and interpret that to figure out what's going to happen and the reasons why behind our analyses. So when we look at the first four of these, what we call the systemic industry factors, the economy is what basically determines what we as users can buy and our companies can afford to invest in. So the more buoyant the economy, the stronger the demand. User demand then determines what we actually buy. Capacity determines our ability to make those units, and the average selling price is what we get as a result of all that work. So we'll take a detailed look at each of these four items in turn. And first, the economy. It's pretty clear that back in March this year, COVID-19 really caused what we liken to a train wreck or a car crash on the highway. It brought the world to a halt. So it was very unlike previous economic recessions where you have a collapse, but it's more of a slowdown in demand. This actually ground things to a halt, which explains why the GDP is going to grow overall negative 4.4% this year, which is very unusual. We never see growth rates that negative before. Even in the financial crisis in 2008, the world economy only shrank by 1%. So this is quite unusual. And therefore, it's not unsurprising to find a rebound, a reaction from that, a strong reaction, with the economy forecast next year to bounce back 5.2%, which is much higher than the long-term average. That dotted line you see on the graph here is the long-term average. But of course, it's going to be a precarious path back to normality as we experience the second waves, which are currently living through now, and maybe third or subsequent waves after that, and the uncertainty behind whether or not what impact the COVID-19 will have. The real question is, does GDP growth actually matter? How important are these numbers? We know that the economy matters, but what about the growth rates? And the answer to that question is, yes, they do matter, but then again, no, they don't. The correlation is tight, as you'd expect, with a stronger economy fueling increased demand. But also, you can find a strong semiconductor growth in a weak economy. Not very often, but it has happened. But you can certainly find a weak semiconductor market in a strong GDP growth. and that's typically when we've had overcapacity in the industry or an excess of inventory being purged from the supply chain. So certainly there is a tight correlation, but it is not 100%. And the good news is that the chip market this year, 2020, is actually still going to grow despite that major severe GDP collapse. When you look then at unit demand, this is one of what we call the real industry heartbeat, because the demand what you actually buy has demonstrated an incredibly consistent trend over data that goes back over 40 years. And the fundamental trend in unit growth has been 8% per year. There's been periods of acceleration and periods of correction, which are natural. Whenever you get an overheating, you're always bound to get a correction. But the long-term trend has been incredibly consistent at this 8% per year. So my message to you today is don't ever bet against this benchmark. There's been a time when people are mindful to say the unit growth is going to increase, as was the case with the early IoT forecasts, and another time when people are saying that the unit growth is going to slow down because of the complexity of the ICs, who can use this stuff here, and that also has to be taken with a great big pinch of salt. There's no reason to believe why that growth rate will not continue into the future. Which then leads us to the wafer fab capex spend, and we do know that if we overinvest in capacity, there you will be an oversupply and a price reduction and a semiconductor slump. We also know if you don't have enough capacity, you will get no wafers out and you will get no sales. So there is a very interesting balance to strike there between trying to get the capacity into synchronization. And that's very hard to do because demand is a straight line, whereas capacity comes on in step functions. As a new fab comes on, a huge new wave of capacity comes on pretty much instantaneously. So it is impossible to balance that. The good news is that the amount of capacity we have out now at the advanced technology levels, whether it's memory or logic, is actually quite restricted. With only 4 suppliers left now in advanced memory production, and really only 2 in advanced logic production, with Intel as a bit of a wild card, which means that the control of capacity is much tighter than it was in the past. But the bad news is that the trend line is actually drifting above what we determined to be the safe level of capex spend. So we're now seeing that the levels of capex are actually approaching something which will cause us cause for concern. They actually don't at the moment because all of that excess capex spending is based in China, who is now the biggest capex spender in the world. Surprising, but it's true. Therefore, the impact of that is actually unlikely to affect the rest of the world. It's them that's spending the money, and not all of that money is going to be spent productively, but it's unlikely to have an impact on the rest of the world industry, at least in the short term. There are risks, though, with this dominance of supply. There's a geographic concentration in Korea and Taiwan, which is both a geopolitical and an economic risk. And there's also another problem behind this concentration is that there is now no plan B for advanced logic. There are incompatible processes between TSMC and Samsung. Therefore, you're now not only sole sourced, you're also single sourced as well. And to redesign a chip, if you had to go to a new supplier, it's completely impractical now. That's a 2 to 3 year design process there. So we are single sourced, we are sole sourced, and we have the geographic risks of Taiwan, of course, being in an earthquake zone, and the political risk of the potential unknown impact of China. The unit ASP, the long-term growth here, 0. Now, that is contradictory to what one would imagine, because we think, oh, we're designing all these bigger chips. Are we really not going to get any more money for them? And the answer is the average ASP for integrated circuits remains 0. And that's a trend which has been consistent again over the 40 years of the industry. So it's another one of these don't bet against kind of dynamics. You must always keep that in mind. It's being held hostage, unfortunately, to Moore's law. The more we invent better chips, also the more we decrease the chip size of the chips we just produced, we cost reduce them, and the net result is basically a balance and a net 0. So what we're seeing here is that we do have this situation whereby you have this very sharp decline in the average selling price over a 4 to 5 quarter period, but then you have a long, steady recovery over a 4 to 5 year period. So it's a very long cycle and one which is overlooked in the industry. But the main point behind that is we must always remember that average selling prices, unit prices of integrated circuits are driven by cost and not by value. It's a cost-driven, not a value-based industry. And that is, unfortunately, one of the downsides to Moore's Law. So the scorecard is the economy is bouncing back for sure, but it's fragile, with China leading the way. Unit demand is holding firm with some overbooking in China, but again, it's limited mostly to Chinese companies. Capacity is tight in the near term, and there's no slack in the system. So if the economy does bounce back, we will move into a shortage system pretty quickly. And the ASPs are maintaining the recovery they started. They've not collapsed. They're holding their own. So the overall factors are actually all pretty stable and in a positive vein. The next two factors are more industrial related, and one is the push, Moore's Law, and we'll talk about that first. Now, of course, we all know that Moore's Law is dead. We've been told that many times by various industry sources, but the fact remains is that when you look at the historical basis for that, it doesn't hold up. And already in 2022, and we're only 1 year into this decade, we've had two 50 billion transistor chips released on the market by Graphcore and NVIDIA. The Apple A14 chip, 12 billion transistors being built on the very latest advanced logic process in the world. And that's just in the first year of this decade. My belief is you will see the first 100 billion transistor chip within the next 18 months. But the only uncertainty being who will actually be first to market on that. And by the end of the decade, Moore's Law will still be very much alive and running, and we'll be seeing 400 billion, maybe even higher chips by the end of the decade. Gordon Moore, I think, could never have figured out that that was what was going to happen. Bottom line, Moore's Law is not dying, it's not even sick, and it certainly isn't dead. When you look at the work being done in IMEC and the new transistor structures, we're seeing devices there which are waiting to pick up the gauntlet and take us through for the rest of this decade. And TSMC is no charlatan to the challenge of actually turning the R of the IMEC into the D of development. And we're seeing there that actually Moore's Law at TSMC has been accelerating over the last 3 years or so. They've almost been on a 1.5-year cycle with a little help from their fruity friend, but that's no bad thing. It is a good partnership, and the whole industry benefits from that partnership. And as I said, Gordon Moore could never have imagined such progress and so many people working on developing the technology. The second of those industrial factors is the market pull. And this really comes down to doing something previously impossible or achieving the right size, form factor, or cost point to enable that product to become a meaningful reality, whether it's from the early hearing aid, which was impossible using valve technology, or in terms of data storage, where here you're looking at 5 megabytes of data are stored on 65,000 punch cards back in 1966. We can all see the number of applications that are around us today, and we've seen the impact of COVID, whether it's in working from home, video conferencing, online gaming, streaming, high-definition movies, home-based learning, whether it's at university, schools, or for our own personal benefit, and telemedicine. All of these coming into their own, being given a huge impetus by the COVID-19. They were happening anyway, but sometimes change happens slowly, and this proved a big tipping point to accelerating these new applications. The driving factors behind them are all the technologies we're very familiar with, whether it's the new 5G and other wireless type technologies, the increasing computer power, data centrification, more connection, more sensing, more smart, more artificial intelligence, more use of robotics in medicine and elsewhere. All of these things are happening, and they're all there. They're all the pieces which make this world go around. But to me, the most exciting one is e-medicine, e-healthcare. In fact, I tend to call it iMedical, and you'll see why in a minute. But that, to me, is the next big killer app. And I think, when you're looking at the medicine, what's happening here, my forecast is that Apple will be a major driving factor in this marketplace here. And to me, their reasons for moving into watches and devices like that was not simply to change a watch to tell the time. It is to do all these other things. It is the apps that developed it, whether they're in terms of health, in terms of running and measuring your performance and things like that. But now they're moving into more medical-related aspects, and already their watch is approved in Japan to do certain medical measurements, and that now is overcoming one of the other big obstacles in medical and healthcare, and that is the resistance of the healthcare community, the doctors, who are basically turning Luddite and don't want the electronics, the semiconductor, to take over their world. But in fact, now realizing that it can do a better job of a lot of the mundane things and enable them to do their job better. So that is a good byproduct, and it happens in every industry. So we've seen COVID give us an acceleration in digitalization, the applications push from the result of that there, and surprisingly also, it's had another push into our awareness on energy efficiency and the move towards smart energy. We saw the impact on pollution, for example, when the world went into lockdown. And suddenly, countries where pollution was a big impact suddenly saw the pollution go away almost overnight. And I think that suddenly made people realize that there is something behind this there. Global warming is a little bit more subjective, a little bit more intellectual for most people to understand. But when they can see the smog has gone, when they can feel the air is fresher, they can suddenly put that together to realize that, hey, energy efficiency, smarter energy, new ways of doing things, green electric vehicles have had a huge push from Corona. I think that will have a tremendous impact on us and push this green agenda and have an indirect impact on global warming. Far more so than the political push, which has been struggling, quite frankly. Putting that together, the winners in all that, of course, will be the microprocessors, the complex SoCs, storage, data hubs, infrastructure, sensors, images, accentuators, transmitters, receivers, a whole raft of products, and that means that everybody will benefit from this next wave. It's not just limited to a few specialist suppliers, as the smartwatch was limited and the PC era was somewhat limited. Adding that all together, what is our outlook for the market in terms of numbers? Well, the latest forecast we have actually on this year, it's almost over, is about a 4% growth. Now that compares with the 5% forecast that we had back in January. So when you look at those two numbers, COVID has had virtually no impact at all on the forecast we had for the semiconductor market before COVID struck. And in fact, looking at that number there, the fourth quarter number we have of minus 2.5% quarterly growth is probably way too conservative. It's much more likely to be 0% growth, which would bring the 4% much closer to, even closer to 5%. So the stage is set for a very strong 2021, and we believe 2001 will come in at about a 12% growth. That's a double-digit growth for next year, just simply based on the economic fundamentals, the industry fundamentals, and the momentum moving into 2021. The risks, of course, are there, and the two biggest risks are the trade war escalation and the second wave lockdown and the impact that might have on the GDP growth and the overall economy. And if those both impact to their full force, you can see $54 billion being taken out of the market next year, which will turn the plus 12% growth into a minus 12% growth. So the risk is there, but the risks are foreseeable. You will see both of those coming. You will have plenty of visibility into both of those effects, so you will have plenty of warning to take reactive measures to protect against those impacts if they do hit. Now, the latest election result in the United States probably means that there's probably less pressure on a trade war escalation with the new administration that will take place in January. And the lockdowns, so far, we haven't seen too much impact of that. from a GDP point of view, but of course it will have an impact on growth, but we don't know what the real impact that would be in terms of the economic drive. So it's an uncertainty. We have to just be careful. But even if we had some small semblance of that, you should still see growth next year. To finally close up with, I'd just like to look at the actual value chain itself. And this chart here, this inverted triangle, looks at the feed into the industry, semiconductors in the middle there, and the end equipment and the services on top, and the material equipment to make the semiconductors underneath. And the size of the numbers there is the market size for each of those sectors. Now, when you look at those and relate that to the semiconductor market, and we equate those back to the value of the semiconductors produced. And so $9 per centimeter is what you get in the semiconductor industry. So that's the value of the semiconductor production per square centimeter of silicon wafer processing. And it's been $9 per square centimeter on average since the beginning of the industry. It's another one of these remarkable constants. If you're a foundry, you only get $4 per square centimeter. And if you're in the IP industry, you'll get only 10 cents per industry. If you're in the end equipment, you get $35, and if you're in services, you get $450 for every square centimeter of semiconductor that you use. So that's where the money is, and that explains why Apple is now more of a service-related company than it is an end equipment company. It also explains why companies like Facebook and the like are moving into designing their own semiconductor chips. The other factor of that is it turns back to these industry DNA constants. We know that the world GDP on average grows 3.4%. IC unit sales per square centimeter is unit growth about 7%, 7.7%, 8%. ICs per square centimeter, 2.2% growth. The average size doesn't grow very much at all. Average selling prices overall is 0%. They're currently a little bit lower than that because we're moving down zero line. CapEx 12.5%. Number of silicon wafers sold 5.5%. You should always look at these constants to measure, are we above this trend line or below this trend line? Because that will give you an indication of whether the economy is underheating or overheating. But the bottom line is, what more giveth in terms of smaller transistor size, more complexity, more bang for the buck, Moore's law taketh away. You get less bang for the same buck, and the net result is zero. So the key takeaways, the market pull, no shortage of opportunities. In fact, COVID-19 has accelerated many. Ever-increasing datafication and e-medical and eye-healthcare set to dwarf all previous applications. The technology push is still alive and strong. Don't ever bet against this industry. It is the most innovative industry ever. And you people are helping keep this alive. The fundamentals remain sound, and a market rebound next year is inevitable. And beyond that probably as well, as we struggle to keep pace with demand. And the reset has also enabled us to focus on our own growth, scrutinizing the products and the customers that we have, our business portfolio, our CapEx and R&D strategies, strengthening our position in maybe M&A, just to see whether we're in the right place at the right time to ride this next wave. So thank you very much indeed. That's what I wanted to talk to you about today. And thank you for sharing your time with me.
Thank you, Malcolm. That was a great and teaching outlook of semiconductor market. It's time now for some question and answers. So please continue to submit your questions using the Q&A box. If you have minimized your Q&A window, there is an icon at the bottom of your screen with a question mark. So please use that button to submit your questions. I will turn it over now to question and answers. Hello.
Hello?
Hello.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Morning.
So ready for the Q&As now. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box. Just to get started, we prepared a couple of questions, so let me go with the first one. So Malcolm, what is it that has made the industry behave so different in this downturn versus previous recessions?
Yes. Okay, Luke. I think the key thing to remember is that this is not a normal recession. It's been one that's been created by government policy rather than by the normal economic factors. And bizarrely, it's left a lot of people in pretty good shape. They've been on furlough salaries, they've got government support. So for a lot of people, it's actually been more like a holiday rather than a recession. There's a lot of unpleasantness to come across in terms of higher unemployment, but we've seen the impact of these rolling lockdowns when they released. It's released a lot of cash and creativity and pent-up demand into the economy again. So it's really very, very different structurally. And I think that this pent-up demand that's there and building will just fuel a bounce back that's going to be spectacularly strong once we have a vaccine in place and we've kind of licked this bug into shape and the confidence gets back into the world.
The next question would be, Malcolm, so what are the keys to success for a cheap startup?
Yeah, right. Okay. The first thing to remember, it's very hard when you're in a technology-based industry, is that the technology is the means to an end and not the end itself. So many startups and chip companies that we've had the pleasure of dealing with over the years kind of lose track of the fact that they think that because they have a good technology, because they have a great idea, a fantastic invention, that the market will automatically come to them, and it doesn't. You have to find your own market. You have to find where that niche is going to be. And most importantly, you have to understand how it is you are going to disrupt and address that market with the technology that you have. So the technology is a necessity, but it's not the end goal. It's not the end result. Without a market, the technology is useless. So I think you need to have that in mind. And you also have to understand that being first to market is more important than having the perfect product. You've got to get it in there first, out there, start the market rolling, start the development rolling, fix the bugs, the inevitable bugs on the roll. Don't wait to fix them before you release it. Get out there, stay ahead, and that way you're always one jump ahead of the competitors that are trying to catch you up. You've got to keep them in the catch-up mold. And the final, real, most important piece is you've got to find yourself a sugar daddy. You've got to find an end customer that's got deep pockets, that can afford to keep you through this development process in exactly the same way that way back Intel found IBM with the PC, and that helped the 8086 get into the marketplace. And ARM found Nokia as their big customer, which grew them into the company that they are to now, or was the foundation for growing them into the success stories that they are today.
Thank you, Malcolm. The next question I see is, so we know there's a war going on between China and the US on the commercial front. So where does EU stand in the current China-US chip wars?
Okay. This is quite an interesting question, because I think what this has done in the last 12 months or so, since it's really grabbing the headlines, even in the mainstream newspapers nowadays, is finally the world has woken up to semiconductors. Before, it was only really us in the industry that really knew what semiconductors were, and most people think it's half a conductor. But the fact remains is that now people actually know that there are these things called semiconductors, and suddenly a company like TSMC, which was almost completely invisible to anybody outside of the industry, people now know that they're important. So I think it's raised a level of awareness for the chip industry that was never there before. Nobody really appreciated what made their smartphones work, what made everything that we touch around us today, what made these things work. and without them, the world grinds to a halt, because we saw the minute that we put the US put the pressure on Huawei, it really drove that company into the ground, and it was almost instantaneous. I mean, once you run out of inventory, once you run out of the ability to build new products, your business is over. So I think it really has awoken the world up to the very strategic nature of the semiconductor and its importance on not just the end products, but onto the global economy as itself. One of the big results of that has now been this sudden awakening of Made in America, the Chips for America Act and issues like that, where suddenly semiconductor manufacturing is now becoming important again. And that's great. So I think the question I have is, where does Europe stand in that? I don't think Europe has really woken up to semiconductor manufacturing as being important. We tried a few years ago with the Needy Crows plan. That was really ignored. And now I don't see that same kind of energy and recognition in Europe that semiconductors, chip manufacturing in Europe is crucial to Europe's future as well.
Thank you. So we have time for very quickly for last questions. You said the next killer application is iMedical. How do you see Europe playing a big role in this market?
It should do, it must do, and it certainly can do. I mean, companies like IMEC have been doing research on iMedical for years. They are at the forefront of this here. We've got a very strong pharmaceutical industry in Europe, excellent research in the universities throughout Europe. So we have absolutely, and we have the people. We have a huge local marketplace here. The real concern that worries me is, do we have the energy and the ability to scale the creativity that we are developing in Europe into a world global product? And that's something which you don't see that there. And I think this is probably a role where the European Commission, with their programs, with the Horizon 2020 programs, is to really bring all this together to develop a global European standard, some global European platforms in iMedicine, which will give us the strength and ability and the scale to actually start to dominate these new developments in the end markets.
Thank you, Malcolm. I'm just checking the time, so the next presentation is starting in a few minutes, so maybe we should conclude here. Thank you, everybody, for attending this presentation, and thank you, Malcolm, for this all these good answers to these questions, and we should move now to the next presentation.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.